The Nazis listed her as dead. They posted her name on a wall in Warsaw, printed on a sheet, nailed in public, one name among hundreds of executed prisoners. Irena Sendler found that list. She stood in front of it. She read her own name. And then she went back to work. Warsaw, October 1943. The city had been under German occupation for 4 years. The streets had a particular silence that comes not from peace, but from fear, the kind that teaches you to walk quickly, to keep your eyes at the pavement, to become invisible. People had learned to look away from things they couldn't afford to react to. Irena Sendler was 33 years old. She was a social worker. She had no weapon, no military rank, no uniform or official protection of any kind. What she had was a forged pass, a network of roughly 25 people, and a large dog trained to bark on command. And over the previous 2 years, she had used all of it to smuggle children, hundreds of them, out of the Warsaw Ghetto, one at a time, hidden in toolboxes, in burlap sacks, beneath the floors of ambulances, in coffins, through a sewer system that ran beneath the city like a second, darker Warsaw. Then something happened. October the 20th, 1943, 3 in the morning. A fist hit the door of her apartment. She had been expecting it the way you can expect something for a long time without ever fully believing it will arrive. She opened the door. There were several of them. They pushed past her immediately and began tearing the apartment apart, pulling books from shelves, overturning drawers, ripping the lining from furniture. They were looking for lists, names, evidence of the network she had been building and running for nearly 2 years. They found some documents, but they didn't find the jars. They took her anyway. Pawiak Prison sat in the middle of Warsaw like a wound that had never closed. It was the place the Gestapo brought people they wanted to break, not quickly, but with patience. The kind of institutional patience that is, in its way, more terrifying than rage. They broke her legs. They broke her feet. They brought her back to the interrogation room, again and again, day after day, and they asked the same questions. Who was in the network? Where are the lists? Where do the children go? Irena Sendler looked at the men across the table from her, and she said nothing. Not one name, not one address, not one child. To understand why a person could endure that and stay silent, you have to go back. Back before the war. Back before the ghetto and the jars and the toolboxes. Back to a doctor's bedroom in Warsaw in the winter of 1917, and the last words a dying father said to his 7-year-old daughter. Irena's father was Dr. Stanislav Krzyzanowski. He practiced medicine in Warsaw at a time when the city's Jewish poor routinely found doctors' doors closed to them. Many physicians simply refused. The patients couldn't pay enough, or they weren't the right kind of people, or, more often, no reason was given at all. Stanislav Krzyzanowski was different. He went to them. He treated them. He sat with the sick in overcrowded apartments in the poorest neighborhoods in the city, and he asked nothing about their background or their ability to pay. If they were suffering, he came. In 1917, a typhus epidemic swept through those neighborhoods. Typhus travels through lice, which travel through overcrowding and poor sanitation, which were everywhere in Warsaw's poorest districts. The doctor went in anyway, every day for weeks. Then he caught it himself. He died that winter. Irena was 7 years old. Before he lost consciousness, he called his daughter to him, and he said something she carried in her body for the rest of her life. The way certain words become less like memories and more like bones. If you see someone drowning, you must jump in and save them, even if you cannot swim. She grew up in Warsaw. She studied social work at the University of Warsaw in the 1930s. She had Jewish friends, close ones from childhood and from her years at university. And as the decade darkened across Europe, She watched the symptoms of what was coming appear first in the small, incremental humiliations. One of them was the ghetto bench system. Jewish students at Polish universities were required to sit in segregated sections, physically separated from their classmates, in the same lecture halls, as though their presence required a different kind of chair, as though they were a different kind of person. Irena didn't sit in the Polish section in protest. She walked across the room and sat in the Jewish section. The university suspended her for it. She returned the following term. She sat in the Jewish section again. This is who she was before the war began, before the ghetto walls went up, before the toolboxes and the sedated infants and the jars buried in a garden. She was already, quietly, exactly the kind of person the next decade would require. September the 1st, 1939. Germany invaded Poland from the west. Within days, the Soviet Union invaded from the east under the terms of a secret agreement with Hitler. Warsaw was bombed heavily. It held out for 3 weeks. Then it fell. The German occupation of Poland was unlike anything seen elsewhere in Western Europe. Poland was not to be occupied and administered. It was to be hollowed out, its Jewish population eliminated, its Slavic population reduced to slave labor, its land and resources extracted for the Reich. The Nazis did not bother to disguise this in Poland the way they sometimes did elsewhere. In October 1940, the occupying authorities announced the creation of a sealed Jewish district in the heart of Warsaw. Brick walls, 10 feet high, topped with broken glass and coils of barbed wire. Armed guards at every gate. Checkpoints with machine guns. If you were Jewish and you were in Warsaw, you were told to go inside. All of you, more than 400,000 people, into roughly 1 square mile. Then the gates closed. Irena Sendler obtained a forged pass in 1941. Her cover was that of a plumbing and sewage inspector, a sanitation official entering the ghetto to monitor the spread of typhus, which the Nazis feared would leak through the walls into the non-Jewish neighborhoods of the city. It was a perfect cover, practical, believable, boring enough that no one looked too closely. She began entering the ghetto regularly, multiple times per week. What she saw when she walked those streets she described for the rest of her life, and the descriptions never changed because what she saw was unchangeable, burned in. Corpses lay on the sidewalks every morning, covered with newspapers, because there wasn't time or space or manpower to remove them faster than they accumulated. People stepped around them. You learned to step around them. You learned to register them without reacting, the way the body learns to absorb pain it can't afford to express. Children sat against the sides of buildings, some of them too weak to stand, their bellies distended from starvation, their eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Families of 8 lived in rooms designed for 2. Buildings that should have housed 300 people housed 2,000. The official German food ration inside the ghetto was 184 calories per day. A person needs roughly 2,000 calories to function. The ration was less than a tenth of that. It was not a subsistence level. It was a slow execution with paperwork. Between 5,000 and 6,000 people died inside those walls every single month. From hunger, from typhus, from dysentery, from simply being alive in a place designed to kill them. Irena walked those streets, and she saw all of it, and she made a decision. She was going to get the children out. Now, understand what that decision actually meant. In occupied Poland, helping a Jewish person was not punishable by imprisonment or hard labor or confiscation of property. It was punishable by death. Immediate, without trial, without appeal, not just for you, for your parents, your husband, your children, your neighbors if the Gestapo felt like making a larger point. Everyone within reach. The Nazis posted the names of executed helpers on walls across Warsaw, specifically so that people would see them. The message was deliberate. This is what happens. This is what it costs. Irena knew every word of this policy. Every person she recruited into her network knew it. They went in anyway. Building an underground rescue network inside a city under military occupation is not something you do with a plan. You do it with judgment, with patience, with an almost clinical ability to read people, to know who will hold and who will break, who could be trusted and who is simply brave in theory. Irena recruited approximately 25 to 30 people over time. A nurse who could move through checkpoints with medical equipment. A social worker who knew the orphanage system and could place children without questions being asked. A tram driver who had memorized the patrol schedules of every checkpoint on his route. A Catholic priest with connections to a convent on the outskirts of the city that had agreed to take children without documentation. A doctor who would provide pediatric sedatives and ask nothing in return. A cemetery worker who managed the flow of coffins in and out of the ghetto and had noticed that not all coffins need to contain what they appear to contain. Each person knew only their own piece of the operation. This was essential and deliberate. If the Gestapo caught any one of them, if they broke under interrogation, they could only reveal what they personally knew, which wasn't much. The methods they developed across 2 years of operation were staggering in their ingenuity. Infants were sedated with a carefully calculated dose, enough to ensure unconsciousness through a checkpoint, not enough to cause harm, and placed in burlap sacks. The sacks were placed inside toolboxes or wooden crates of vegetables or packages of household goods. The packages were loaded onto carts. The carts moved through checkpoints. Older children were walked through a courthouse building that sat on the physical boundary between the ghetto and the rest of Warsaw. They went in from one side in their original clothes. They came out the other side in different clothes with different names, holding the hand of someone they had never met before. Children moved through the sewer tunnels beneath Warsaw's streets, guided by workers who had spent years learning those tunnels, who could navigate them in total darkness. You only took a child through a sewer when every other route was closed. There was All Saints Church, whose exterior wall was physically integrated into the ghetto boundary. A child could enter from the ghetto side and exit from the street side in the time it took to walk the length of the nave. And then there was the dog. Irena kept a large dog, trained, reliable, calm under pressure. The dog was taught one specific command: bark. Continuously, loudly, on signal. When Irena was moving through a checkpoint with a child or an infant hidden in a container, and a guard started paying too much attention, she would give the dog its signal. The dog barked. Guards almost always stepped back from a barking dog. The inspection shortened. The cart moved through. The dog was trained to be louder than a crying baby, because a crying baby at the wrong moment was the difference between life and death. Let me tell you about one specific child. Her real name was Elżbieta Gelblum. She was 5 months old in the summer of 1942. Her parents, Jakub and Lore, were inside the ghetto. They had heard about Irena's network through the underground contacts that connected these desperate pockets of information. They made the decision to hand their daughter to the network. Elżbieta was sedated. She was placed inside a carpenter's toolbox, padded to prevent injury. The box was carried by one of Irena's colleagues, a woman named Stanislava Bussold, through a checkpoint. A guard looked at the box. He waved her through. The dose of sedative had been measured carefully. If it was slightly too high, the baby would not wake up. Bussold carried that box knowing this. She carried it anyway. Elżbieta survived. She was placed with a Polish family and given a new name. Her parents were deported to Treblinka that same summer. Neither of them came back. Elżbieta is alive today. She is in her 80s. She has spent decades speaking publicly about Irena Sendler. She calls her in the specific, precise way of someone who has thought very carefully about the right words. The woman who gave me my life. There's a question at the center of this story that is easy to overlook if you focus only on what Irena did. The question is this: what does a parent do when someone offers to take their child away, and the alternative is almost certain death for all of you? Irena did not simply smuggle children. She had to first convince parents to allow it. Think about what that conversation looked like from the inside. Irena would sit down with a family in the ghetto, in a room that might hold 10 other people, with the sounds of the street coming through a window, with the knowledge of what was happening outside those walls and what was coming, and she would explain quietly what she could offer. I can get your child out, but I cannot tell you exactly where they will go. I cannot promise you will ever see them again. Your child will be given a new name, a Polish name, a Catholic name. They will be placed with a family or in an institution that will raise them as Polish and Catholic. They may grow up not knowing they were ever Jewish, not knowing your names, not knowing anything about where they came from, but they will be alive. Some parents said no, not because they were making the wrong choice, because they were making the only choice they could make. They could not place their child in the arms of a stranger and watch them disappear through a gate and not know what came next. They couldn't do it. The love that makes you want to save your child is the same love that makes it impossible to let them go. Many of those families were deported together to Treblinka, to other camps. Many of the children who stayed died with their parents. Some parents said yes. Irena described those moments throughout her long life, and she never became clinical about them. A mother pressing her face against her infant for the last time. A father who couldn't find words for what was happening, who just nodded once and then turned and walked back in the room, because if he watched his child leave, he would call out and the whole thing would collapse. A child, old enough to understand something was wrong, reaching back toward a parent who was already walking in the other direction and could not look. Irena said this was the hardest part. Not the checkpoints, not the guards, not the risk of her own death. The parents. There was one mother. Irena spoke of her specifically without giving her name, out of a sense of protective discretion that stayed with her entire life. This woman said no. She could not do it. Irena understood. She left without the child. 2 days later, there was a knock at the contact point. The same woman. She had changed her mind. Irena took the child. She got them out. The mother was never seen again. Every child who passed through the operation carried 2 identities. Their real name, the one their parents gave them, the one that held their family history, their religion, their entire lineage, and a new name, a cover that could keep them alive. Irena wrote both names down on thin strips of tissue paper. Not regular paper. Tissue paper, lighter, less traceable, more easily destroyed if it came to that. She folded the strips and put them into glass jars. She buried the jars beneath an apple tree in the garden of her colleague Jadwiga Piotrowska, on a quiet street in Warsaw. She buried them because she believed the war would end. She believed the parents would come back. The children could be found. Their real names read aloud. Their families made whole. She was right about the war ending. By October 1943, Irena's network had been operating for nearly 2 years. She had made over 200 separate entries into the ghetto. The total number of children moved through the operation, including those handled by her network and the broader Zagota organization, is estimated at somewhere near 2,500. And then someone talked. The Gestapo had been building a file. They knew a network existed. They had fragments, names, partial addresses, the outline of something organized. They had been patient about it, because patience was something the Gestapo had in abundance. On the morning of October the 20th, they acted. The raid lasted several hours. The apartment was methodically dismantled. They found documents, evidence of social welfare work, some names from legitimate channels, materials she hadn't managed to destroy. But they did not find the most important things. They did not find the jars. They did not find the core of the network. They took her to Pawiak Prison. They interrogated Irena over a period of weeks. They used systematic physical torture. They broke both her legs. They broke both her feet. Between sessions, she was held in a cell, then brought back. At one point during the interrogation, the Gestapo placed a document on the table in front of her. Names. Real names. People from her own network. They needed only a confirmation, one nod, one word, one acknowledgement, and those people would be taken. She looked at the document. She said nothing. Not one name confirmed. Not one location revealed. Not one child's placement exposed. The tribunal convened and handed down its verdict. Irena Sendler was sentenced to death by firing squad. Execution scheduled. What do you think about in a cell the night before your scheduled execution? People who knew Irena, who spoke to her about those weeks in Pawiak, reported something that might seem strange. She didn't speak much about fear. She didn't speak much about regret. She talked, when she talked at all, about the children she hadn't gotten out yet. There were families she knew about. A particular section of the ghetto she had been planning to reach. Specific children whose placements were not yet arranged. She thought about them. Inside the underground organization Zagota, the Council to Aid Jews, one of the only government-backed resistance organizations anywhere in occupied Europe dedicated specifically to rescuing Jewish people. A desperate operation had been underway since Irena's arrest. They needed money, a significant amount of it, and they needed to identify a specific type of person, a Gestapo officer who was corrupt, careful, and positioned close enough to the execution machinery to actually affect it. A man who would take a bribe, and who would then keep his mouth shut. This was not simple. Approaching the wrong officer didn't result in a negotiation. It resulted in immediate arrest, followed by execution, of the person who approached and everyone connected to them. They found one. The money changed hands. On the day of the scheduled execution, Irena was removed from Pawiak Prison. She was not taken to the execution site. She was driven to the edge of Warsaw, beaten, barely conscious, both legs broken, and left on a road outside the city. That same day, her name was typed onto the official list of executed prisoners. This was standard Gestapo practice. The lists were printed and posted publicly on walls across Warsaw as a message to the civilian population, as a demonstration of what resistance cost. On that list, on a wall in Warsaw, in black type, Irena Sendler, executed. She read her own name on that list. And then, within weeks, moving on improvised crutches, barely able to stand, she assumed a false identity. She called herself Clara. She had 2 broken legs. She went back to work anyway. She continued under that false name until the Warsaw Uprising of August 1944, when the last organized Polish resistance in the city rose against the German occupation and was crushed systematically. Over 63 days of street fighting that left most of Warsaw in ruins. Irena survived that too. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Warsaw was in ruins. Entire neighborhoods, entire communities, entire worlds had been erased. The Germans had deliberately burned large sections of the city during their retreat as a final act of destruction. Irena Sendler made her way to the garden on the quiet street where Jadwiga Piotrowska's apple tree still stood. She dug. She found the jars. She opened them and began to unfold the strips of tissue paper, one by one. Hundreds of them. Thousands. A real name on one side. A Polish name on the other. A Jewish identity and a Catholic identity, folded together, preserved in glass. And then she began to make inquiries. Where were the families? The parents? The relatives who might be able to take a child back? or at least tell a child who they had been. The answers came back, and they kept coming back the same way. Treblinka, Treblinka, Treblinka. The extermination camp at Treblinka had operated from July 1942 through October 1943. In that time, between 700,000 and 900,000 people had been killed there, the overwhelming majority of them from the Warsaw Ghetto. The transports had begun in the summer of 1942 and continued with the systematic efficiency of an industrial process. The children Irena had saved were alive. They had grown up in Polish families, in convents, in Catholic orphanages. Many of them had grown up genuinely not knowing who they were, believing the story they had been given, the name, the religion, the family. The cover had worked. It had worked completely. But the families those children were supposed to be returned to, the parents who had handed their infants through gates in a wall and walked away and never looked back because they couldn't, most of them were gone. Irena spent years after the war trying to reconnect children with whatever surviving relatives could be found. Aunts, uncles, grandparents who had been in other cities when the transports came. A few mothers who had survived the camps against all probability. Some of these reunions happened. Many didn't. Then Communist Poland made the work harder. Irena's wartime connections to the underground Home Army, to the London-based Polish government in exile, made her politically inconvenient to the new authorities. The communist government built its legitimacy on a specific version of Polish wartime history, and Irena's story didn't fit it. She wasn't suppressed violently. She was simply not mentioned, not acknowledged, left to live quietly in Warsaw, carrying a story that almost no one had asked her to tell. In 1965, Yad Vashem honored her as righteous among the nations, one of the highest distinctions given to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jewish people during the Holocaust. It was meaningful recognition, but outside of a small circle, her name remained largely unknown. She was an elderly woman in Warsaw with a limp that never fully healed, carrying decades of something most people would have called an extraordinary life. She called it incomplete. In 1999, in a town called Uniontown in Kansas, a high school history teacher named Norman Connard gave 4 of his students a project. He handed them a newspaper clipping, 2 paragraphs, barely, that mentioned a Polish woman who had helped rescue Jewish children from the Warsaw Ghetto during the Second World War. The 4 students, teenagers 16 and 17 years old, in a small town in the American Midwest, read the clipping and felt something they couldn't quite name. They couldn't believe this story was real. They began to research. They found almost nothing. A few sparse references in historical archives, documents in Polish they couldn't read, a name that appeared occasionally in footnotes, but almost never in the main text of anything. So they wrote it themselves. They created a short play about Irena Sendler's life and called it Life in a Jar. They performed it at their school, then at other schools, then at theaters and community centers across the state. The play was eventually performed over 200 times. Word of it traveled to Poland. An elderly woman in Warsaw heard about a group of American teenagers who had been standing on stages in Kansas and telling her story to audiences she had never known existed. The students traveled to Warsaw. They met Irena Sendler in person. She was in her 90s by then, small, sharply alert, warm in the way of someone who has spent a lifetime paying close attention to people. She walked with a cane. She told them, gently, that the 2,500 figure most often cited was likely an overstatement of her personal contribution. Her own network had done a significant part of the total, but not all of it. Then she told them something else. She told them she had not done enough. In 2007, Irena Sendler was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. She was 97 years old. The committee deliberated and announced their decision. The prize went to Al Gore for a documentary about climate change. Irena received a standing ovation from from the Polish parliament. She died on May the 12th, 2008. She was 98 years old. The apple tree still stands. The jars are gone. The strips of tissue paper carefully archived and studied, their names traced as far as tracing can go. Elżbieta Fikowska, the baby in the carpenter's box, is in her 80s today. She still speaks about Irena Sendler. Adam Selnikier, smuggled out as a child, grew up to become Adam Rotfeld, the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs. Hundreds of others, scattered across Europe and Israel and the Americas, are living lives they would not otherwise have had. Irena Sendler never accepted the word hero. When people applied it to her, she corrected them the same way each time. She would say, "Every child I saved is the only justification of my existence on this earth." And then she would say that she should have saved more. Her father died in 1917. He was a doctor who walked into sick rooms because someone had to. He told his 7-year-old daughter that if she saw someone drowning, she had to jump in, even if she couldn't swim. Irena Sendler saw thousands of people drowning. She couldn't save all of them, but she jumped in. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about the parents, about the jars, about a woman reading her own name on a list of the dead and going back to work anyway, share this video. Not for the numbers, but because Irena Sendler's story was buried for 50 years by politics and silence and the noise of a world that had moved on. The least we can do is keep it from being buried again. I'll see you in the next one.